Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation that we're going to be doing here for Star East on this virtual event, where we're going to be talking about communication. We are going to be giving some introductions, right, amigo Noel?
That's right. We'll be talking about communication for QA and testers in particular, especially when speaking to management.
Yes, exactly. That's going to be the topic for today. But you may be wondering why we said we. Why are there two guys talking at the same time in this presentation? So, well, to clarify then,
We will be joining forces in a tag team match.
exactly, we will be tagging through all the slides a la luchador way, so that everyone on their corner will be stretching out the hand and asking to be allowed into the ring or the presentation. So, before we move on as well, you may be wondering, if you don't know already, who are these two weird guys coming together and trying to present and talk to us? So let's go on with some presentations. I'm gonna go first. So I am Leandro Melendez. I am a manager for a performance testing area in the company Qualitas Group. As well, I am known in the internets as Señor Performo, that's my not so secret identity. That came from starting to write a blog about performance testing. And from there, several things started to deviate. I was invited to become the host of the first and only, still only, performance testing podcast in Spanish, Pervites en Español. And after that, I started an initiative of a few channels in YouTube where I try to explain as well all these performance testing topics, as well some other testing topics. We have another video series with my company, Qualitas Group. And in the end, I am a presenter. Used to be a public speaker, but public, like literally in front of people, is kind of difficult nowadays. But now we go virtual, as you can see now. Now it's turn for my amigo Noel.
Yeah, as you know now, my name is Noel Wurst. I head up communications at SmartBear, which communications includes everything from blogs, PR, social media, research reports, product launches, introducing new hires, DEI stuff, and presentations like these. But for anyone thinking, oh, great, a marketer, and before you start planning and looking at other items in the agenda that you may want to attend as well, I'm also an exploratory testing fanatic. Exploratory testing was where I got my first introduction to the tech world, and I've never lost that fascination for it. And I still today think it's just the greatest area of technology and love talking about it, reading about it, watching presentations at conferences like Star East about it, because it offers such a great opportunity to tell a story. And essentially, I am a storyteller in both my personal and professional lives, and love helping other people tell great stories, finding the things that make up great stories, and sharing that knowledge with people like yourselves here in the audience today. You can also see some more of my writing and my own storytelling and carryings on at my website, noelwurst.com, and at Noel Wurst on Twitter. I also want to say thank you to TechWell, and for those who also don't know, that's actually where I got my start in the tech industry, was as a TechWell employee long ago. They are some of the nicest folks in the world. They gave me my big break, and I appreciate the TechWell family and those who are running the show here at Star East this week for having Leandro and I to this fantastic event.
And on my side, I want to thank Noel. Thank you very much, amigo, for inviting me to join forces on this presentation, and as well to TechWell, because they gave us the permission to do this interesting experiment that you're about to experience. And I'm very happy to be here. Thankful to all of you also, the ones that were brave enough to watch us. And again, I cannot express how much I am thankful to all of you.
Yeah, we're both very thrilled to be here. So it's fun to get to present a topic like this to this crowd, and look forward to some Q&A. There is the opportunity to do Q&A after the session, so I think you have the ability to submit those at any point. Those of you who are familiar with the platform that TechWell uses here, you'll see where you can do that, and look forward to chatting with folks after this is over. So Leandro, let's get started. How are you and I going to divide and tackle, emphasis on tackle, with this being a wrestling-themed event today?
Yeah, of course. what things are going to be talking about today. We're going to be dividing them in a modular way that made sense to us to make it easy, and following this story motive to explain it to you. First of all, we're going to explain to you why do we choose these stories, why do we tell them, why are them important, and what's the deal about these stories. And after that,
we will then talk about the importance of knowing your audience. Before any great story gets told or any audience determines that that was a great story, a lot of times there's been a lot of homework done to determine who was going to be in the crowd. Who are you trying to communicate this story to? Did you do your homework on learning not just who that person is or who that crowd is, but what moves them? What doesn't move them? What will drive them to go to another session in the agenda? What will drive them to leave the room? How can you communicate with them and connect with them in a way that gets the response that you would like to get from your story?
And after that, we are going to jump and give you some examples, some real life experiences that both Noel and I had experienced around this topic of communication in QA and in general with people, so that you can get some better learning experiences through experiences, given the redundancy, which are some of the best examples on how to get into it. We will share you a way to get good stories through some real life stories.
And then we'll close things out with some helpful tips that kind of go into any storytelling. Whether, again, you're talking about storytelling you're selling to your kids, to your boss, professional, personal, whatever they are, there are some things that go into great stories, almost all great stories, that you can add to your own to give them the best chance of landing, of connecting with your audience in a meaningful way.
So now let's begin. Let's start defining these reasons, the whys of our topic.
I'm not quite ready to be tagged into the match just yet, Leandro. I'm still limbering up over here in the corner. So go ahead and kick it off. Why are stories important?
With these stories, why are them important? Why are we making such a big fuss about them today? Stories help us to transmit emotions. It's how can we relate truly to data, because stories can contain data and emotions. We tell them as that important matter to help us to make sense of our world. They help us to figure out things, to understand what happens around us, and as well at the same time after that to share those stories with others. They more or less involve a symbiotic exchange in between the storyteller and the listener, where we're trying to transmit those data bits. That information is data in the end. What we are trying to transmit through our stories is data. In the end, most of it surrounds delivery mechanisms for data. So how can we make that better, amigo Noel?
You need the right ingredients, because without the right ingredients, stories can also be what? They can be incredibly boring. I mean, boring stories to me are truly unbearable. I mean, they're hard to sit through, they're hard to listen to, they're hard to understand why you're even being told the story. And a lot of times data on its own isn't a story, and I don't really care how data driven or metrics driven the rest of the world wants to be or declare themselves as. I think of myself more as story driven. But at the same time, my stories contain data. Just like Leandro said, it's not that being story driven or emotion driven means you don't include data in your stories, because if you only use emotion, that's not really going to work either. So, but like Leandro said, stories contain data and emotions. Emotion is not really found in spreadsheets and databases alone. You have to add emotion to them, because numbers on their own don't really make for a great story. And to be fair, emotion alone can make for a pretty unrelatable story for the rest of your audience as well, especially if they're sitting there wondering when you're finally going to back up your emotion with some numbers already. You have to establish a rapport with your audience. You have to give them a reason to get involved or to act, and not to just thank you and leave the room, or what sometimes happens, to just leave the room. Like Leandro said, if you've effectively, quote, made sense of your world, in some ways, you formed a relationship with your audience to the point where your story encouraged them to express a number of proactive, supporting responses, some of which we'll get to a bit later.
And it is very important as well for you to be aware that even if we are talking about the same story, the same data points, we can make it interesting or not interesting at all. Again, even if it's exactly the same story, just by telling it in different ways, we can make it better, or we can make it worse. The way that we can vary it is the way how you deliver it. How do you massage this story, these data points that you want to transmit to your audience? How are you giving them? I like a lot this analogy of the Snyder Cut, where there were differences on the same story, where you variated not only color, tone, some editions, special effects, temperature of your takes, and well, there were differences here and there of choice of words, some different words telling the same story. One made it funny, the other made it serious, incredibly sober, and slightly depressing, but it was a better story one way, different than the other. Everything affects, even in the background, having more time, less time. If your story takes only 2 hours to tell or takes 4 hours to tell, depending on who are you telling this to, it's gonna variate the end result a lot. Some people are willing to sit in a movie theater for 4 hours or more. Some others do not have more than an hour and a half, 2 hours. So it's gonna be different, and you will establish, as Noel mentioned very well, a different rapport.
Leandro just mentioned the Snyder Cut of the Justice League story, and have to admit something, I haven't actually seen the Snyder Cut. But just from that one GIF and that last slide, or even this one here of Jon Stewart, what can we tell that both of these, action-packed superhero movie and then this scene from a comedy TV show both have? It's tension. One of my all-time favorite marketing and communications guys or gurus is Jay Acunzo. Jay's great. He recently shared a newsletter that was so impactful to me. You should really look him up. Seriously, JACUNZO. It's a great mailing list. And the newsletter said, we need tension to create any story. Jay Acunzo, and I'm going to read a short bit from that newsletter here that I now keep on my desk to remind me every day as I'm writing my own story. Jay says, early on in a creative career, we tend to shy away from tension. And this means our work looks and feels mainly like advice or opinions or flat descriptions. If you think about it, there are lots of advice and opinions and flat descriptions on the internet, we'll say. Lots, far more than good stories. And it's because they lack tension. Because without tension, there's no story arc, and so the work feels flat, or it just feels like advice that you can take it or leave it, it doesn't really matter. But then he goes on in the newsletter to describe the reality of great stories, saying that at the end of a great story, new questions emerge, far more questions than nice, neat answers, and as the tension rises and falls, because that's how life works, and there's never going to be total clarity on anything. This is what life is like for you as testers sometimes. You find bugs, or what if you find something that you can only say that at that point in time might be a bug? Who's to say? Who will say? Who will determine whether it's a bug? What would impact what they might say? A story. A story with tension that might even change the way that someone thinks. What if it changed the impression of what you do at that organization, or of what your value is as a tester? Great stories have the ability to do this all the time. They change minds. They influence people's decisions. They influence people's impressions about you and your work. In teaser alert, we will give some examples later on of the types of tension you can add to your stories that will get these types of important questions being asked by your audience, and decisions being made, and new decisions and pivots that maybe weren't going to be made possible if someone only looked at the data.
And it's very well said, Noel, that tension, drama is in general the fuel of life. I have heard, I cannot quote who, but I have heard that phrase, and it's really important that you add that drama, because that drama will be very different for the audience. Now let's talk about the main thing that makes us change our stories. It is specifically the audience. Why do we add different drama to different people, or how can we tell it better, worse? In this matter, we need to pay attention a lot on to who receives the story, marks vastly how are we going to deliver it. So let's start checking these details. How do we define the who?
It's like Leandro just said, who? Who is the audience? Who should be your audience? How many different audiences can your story be told to? And after telling a story to one audience, can you think of a way that you might be able to change that story a little bit to where you can tell it to a different audience and get different responses? I mean, you could use this session as an example. I could put this session on my own website, but I probably wouldn't make it more geared towards software testers. I would want people who weren't testers to be able to find their value, find their takeaways in it. I could put it on all sorts of other sites, but I have to change the story each time. But that's okay. That's not a have to, it's more of a get to. You get to make the story better. You get to make it more relatable to the audience, especially as you try telling stories to more and more audiences. I'm not talking about just repurposing the same story by taking the same story and making it a blog, and the same story then in a white paper, and the same story then in a conference presentation. We're talking about 3 different stories because we expect 3 different audiences to come in and consume those. So you can't just stop also at thinking that your audience is, I know, I'll tell it to the managers this time. Like, the managers isn't a defined enough group. And to be honest, testers as a whole isn't really a defined enough group. You need to know more about your audience. You need to do your homework to find out who they really are, what interests them, what definitely doesn't interest them, so you can leave that stuff out of your story. What moves them? What keeps them up at night? What challenge at work are they racking their brain trying to solve? Where by learning that, you might spot some opportunities to share some work that you've done or some findings that you've just uncovered that relate directly to those things. And including those in your stories is a must. You have to do that to connect with that person or with that room sometimes.
And another element, very important when you are telling those stories, is that you can tell them through the data or vice versa. Transmit data through your stories. And try not to just to share that data. It's by itself tends to be boring. As we know, it could be just a word, it can be just a measurement, a metric, and just numbers, just isolated words tend to be boring. If we don't mix them well, this data can become incredibly boring. So what we want is to transmit all this data and in a way that is important, relevant, interesting, and to make people ask questions like, what have I learned from this data? Or what does that mean for my organization? What impacts can happen? And those questions will vary, especially as well, depending on who is in your organization that you're telling, and how can you add some tension, some drama into your data? How can you make it dramatic or tensionful? So that you can explain it and show it depending on what's the impact that anyone will get. So make it relevant to have something to do with the needs, the priorities of your audience. Ultimately, a story might suffer if it's not well told, if you are not focusing it towards what would be the impact, what can be the problem with this data, what is going to happen in the company. Make a story, make it flow around it so that you can communicate it, and I don't know, drive a change in your organization, generate some action, a growth from your employer, a benefit, a bug to be fixed. There are multiple things that you can generate through this data. But there's a key element, as I started to scratch a little bit about this story, this data, that our friend Noel will help us now.
It's how to now tell the story. You've identified the topic of your story, you've chosen the right data, you've got the right audience. What are you going to do now? How are you going to tell the story? And a lot of times it boils down to, what do you want the outcomes of that story to be? Do you just want a pat on the back? Do you just want to be told, thanks for sharing that, and leave the room and have everyone leave the room? I don't know, maybe, but you might be able to get more. And what Leandro just kind of proved there was like the point that I'm about to make, is that there are so many questions that can be asked after a great story. It doesn't mean that the story didn't contain all the answers it was supposed to, or that it was confusing, or, I mean, certainly people can have questions out of the story, after a story, that would make it a bad story. But I'm talking about questions about, how can I help? How can I chip in? How can I share this story further? What else can you learn? What else can you show me? There are so many great questions that you should be striving for and not have to do that much effort to get by just telling a good story. And just like your stories will hopefully leave your audience with questions, I hope this story leaves you with questions after hearing our story. Questions like, how does my work relate to the rest of my organization or the rest of my team? Is there any data in this last bug report that I ran that I can share with my team or share with others? Because I think it might actually closely relate to their goals and what they're trying to accomplish. Would this data that I alone am so fascinated by be fascinating to someone else if I framed it with some emotion and some tension to make it so? We're talking again about making your story relatable. That's how you tell a story. There's a reason people in my world of communications keep trotting out the same tired question to executives of what keeps you up at night. I mean, you'd think we'd get creative enough by now to ask them something different, but the reason we keep doing it is because there's a lot of valuable information in that answer. You could start asking this question to your own management and other leadership because you're looking for an opportunity to tell them something relatable. You're looking for an opportunity to show them how your work, your findings, your new idea, or your need for a particular tool, because sometimes we just want money from telling a good story, and we need it to get some new tool that we have, and they have it, depending on how high it is or who you're talking to. But to get their interest or their buy-in or the signing on a contract, you've got to make your story relatable. You have to tell it in a way that makes the outcome or the next story you have to tell really enviable for them. And you do that by finding out what they want. You do it by you finding out what they're missing, what they haven't been able to accomplish on their own before you walked in the door and pulled up your magical PowerPoint deck. Which, let's take a minute to appreciate this PowerPoint deck. I can assure you it was entirely designed by my tag team partner here. Speaking of which, Leandro, your turn.
Thank you, Noel. It's a pleasure to generate this type of slides and make them entertaining, good stories, and that they help our audience to get engaged on the story and the adventure that we are telling. But another element that you have to be careful when you're telling your story is to make sure that what you are communicating, everyone understands it, that everyone has the same language. They are calling the same things by the same names. The same happens with the tools, the reach of what you're trying to say on your story. You need to have clear messaging. Here, a good practice or best practice on your story is to give all those information bits to your audience when you think that they might be confused, misunderstood, or plainly that when you are talking about topics that they most probably do not know. Explain what are the terms that you are going to be going through your story, which already great storytellers and famous stories that you already know are doing. They tend to tackle those things even at the very beginning. They tell you what is an infinity stone so that you are interested about it for the rest of the story. What's the deal with the force and why it is important. As well, why the kryptonite makes the man of steel weaker. All that is important. Even like key questions that people, when they joined your story at the very beginning, did not know. What is the matrix? What are all of these situations? You need to make sure that everyone that is listening to your story is on the same page, knows what is an infinity stone, and understands the kryptonite issues. What is the deal with the force? All of this is super important so that you can avoid some situations that we're gonna be talking on now.
Miscommunications. All of those things that Leandro just mentioned are what leads to miscommunications. Missed opportunities to connect a story of yours to your audience's daily lives. Missed opportunities perhaps to be invited back in that room to tell another story. If they think that it's going to have an equally minimal impact or influence on them. So it is really important to, when you get the opportunity to speak to a group, especially if it's a group you don't talk to every day or every week. Maybe it's upper management, maybe it's ELT, maybe it's a conference presentation like this. Really have a lot of respect for the opportunity that you've been given to tell a story. Make sure you do your homework to hopefully tell it the most effective way so that you are invited back into that boardroom or that conference or that brown bag lunch and learn session, whatever it is. There are lots of opportunities to go out and talk about your work and to go into it showing how relatable it is to the rest of the org. So let's talk about some examples where that didn't happen.
Yeah, and let me begin with one story that relates to what I was just talking a moment ago. That having everyone on the same page is super important, and especially in QA, in test practices, I have experienced multiple situations where an organization doesn't have their topics, their terminologies exactly in the same lane. A story that I like a lot, The Perks of Being Earnest, I think it was the title of the book. They mention a lot, let's call a spade and not a gardening tool. In our case, a testing tool, which causes a lot of confusion as well, where some organizations, and this is a true life experience, this happened in real life, I constantly come to organizations which use the test something terms interchangeably, where they call a test case a scenario, where they call a test script a functional testing, an automation in general testing. So multiple organizations suffer from these communications mishaps, if you want to call it. And the story per se, as it was, I had the experience coming to a customer where they were doing several automated tests, and there were some errors that could be caught manually. And I will keep telling them like, hey, you should skip automation and try to catch these through manual executions through some other methods. After an hour of discussions, arguments, the customer kept being severely scandalized that I kept proposing not to automate. After an hour and a half, the one person in the meeting room, a friend of mine, pulled me aside and told me, hey, in this organization, probably you have not noticed or no one has told you, they call testing in general automations. So that's when I was like, oh. So that was a big misunderstanding. And you cannot blame on them using the term. Someone taught it that way, but you could blame me on me as well, not clarifying at the very beginning that I was going to be talking and referring to it with those terms. So at the very beginning, again, you should clarify what you are talking about, what are the terms, and probably from my experience, if you start to notice that people react in, let's call it a peculiar way, ask them like, hey, why is it my story not matching with you? Why is it not clicking? And probably you will figure out. But this is a clear example for when organizations do not call a spade, and all of those are gardening tools. Moving on, time for a story from the amigo Noel. Noel.
Yeah, I've got an example of one recently where I narrowly avoided telling a bad story, having an example of severe miscommunication. I recently ran a report for an area of my job that I focus on, which is on share of voice. That's how often your company name or your product names or whatever the search terms are, how often they show up in the media, whether by it's journalists, analysts, other reporters, independent bloggers, whoever. And so I ran this very long report. It was about 40 slides long. And there was a ton of really valuable information in there to me, really valuable data for me. And I wasn't sure who else would want to see it, but at one point I wanted to at least show the rest of the marketing team what I had recently been working on, because it was a long project. And when I did, I was asked to share it with the rest of the executive leadership team. So that was a big honor to be asked to go in and take this all the way into the boardroom with that group. And I was just so excited to get to tell this. And I just started immediately just working on my story and just writing and scripting everything out. And I'm going to say this about this slide, this about this slide. And one of the members of that group does a very charitable act, and that is anytime an external person from outside the ELT is coming in to share something with that group, she will meet with them beforehand to see what they're going to share and hear the story they're planning on presenting, to give them some helpful tips, to let them know how to connect all these things that we're talking about doing, how to make sure your story gets across, how to make sure they don't start pulling out their phones or looking like Bart Simpson here as you're telling your story. And when I pulled up my deck, she saw that it was about 40 slides long, and she said, please tell me you're not planning on sharing a 40 slide deck in this presentation. And I was like, I don't know, it's what I was planning on doing. I hadn't really been told otherwise. You shouldn't always have to wait until you're told, but I didn't really think anything of it. And she said, I would trim it down to about 3 or 4. And I was like, just taken aback. I mean, this was my baby, this 40 slide report I'd spent so long, putting together and analyzing and deducing all kinds of things from. And I was like, I wasn't offended by it. I was just so thinking like, how in the world am I going to condense what I've done, what I've learned in 3 or 4 slides, when it really took 40 to learn all that I did. And she was like, that you've got 3 or 4 slides. I wouldn't show them more than that or you're going to lose the room. So I did so. And what I was able to do is then share those 3 or 4 And what was great was then immediately someone raised their hand. Of course, I chose 3 slides that showed us as being very favorable, very high up. And there were some reports where we didn't pull or we didn't show up as high. And someone actually raised their hand and said, I'd be really curious to see how we match up against this search term, against these companies. I'm sure you pulled that. Would be very curious to see that. That was great. I got a question. I got attention. I got interest. I got tension, from the room. And what we ultimately decided was that I would make the whole deck available as an appendix at the end of the presentation. Thankfully, I hadn't showed the entire thing because that one slide he was asking for was about 27 slides deep, and we would have never made it there. I would have lost the room. So again, when you're talking to management in particular, a lot of times you might have something that you are so excited about. You want to tell them the whole story, the whole journey, everything about it that means so much to you. You might have a very limited amount of time. You might not get the hour and a half that Leandro got with his previous story. You may get 5 minutes, and it can be really hard to condense everything in that. But what you do is you leave them wanting more. You leave them wanting the rest of your data, the other places that emotion popped up in that report, and you let them have access to that. And then you'll get invited to come back and maybe share the rest of that story at another time.
Now, to keep moving with these stories that we experienced because of the communication was not the best, the stories were not correctly implemented, to call it in a way. My experience that I'm going to share now is to tell the story in a way that you know what is being required, what is the mission, as I was saying as well, the statement, what are we trying to achieve? Because in an example with a customer, we had some requirements that when management even tells you the story a little bit misaligned, not in the best way, you are at times like, what am I supposed to do? You can correct the story if you tell, as very well happen to know. If you notice that it's being told wrong, you should correct it. Because in this customer that we were working on, they were extremely focused on the metrics of pass and fail. How many tests were passing, how many tests were failing. And sometimes it's right to figure out and try to keep the quality in with pass and fail criteria. And coming from my world, performance testing is not always a pass or fail. It took 5 seconds. Is that a pass? Is that a fail? And on some others, there are differences that you need to take into account to mark as a good story that is propelling your organization into having good quality. This is when the story is badly or poorly told. The problem that you can get is to generate sinister incentives to the people working in the QA organization or just in general in the organization. What happened in this organization was that the focus was so much on finding pass and fails and finding bugs that on one team, they were trying to make everything pass. They were trying to regardless of the fix. It was more important the pass than the fix. On some other organizations, the story is around how many automations do you have? And they focus on automating the most processes possible, even if that is not efficient. Some others have had the goal of finding several defects. The most defects that you find, the better qualified or the better grade your organization gets. And this also is a sinister incentive because sometimes you start to look for just meaningless bugs, things that might not be so relevant, impactful, but your metric is just to bring defects, bugs, and you might be just hunting for them. If it comes the end of the quarter, the end of the sprint, end of week, and you haven't identified any, probably the application was already awesome, but your requirement was lots of bugs, give me bugs. So this storytelling can generate different problems in your organization if you are not being told as well a good story or you not help correcting it. And you can miscalculate or over impact, exaggerate the impact of some bugs.
Yeah, like Leandro just said, it's a matter of understanding what's important to different teams, different personas, different levels of management, whatever it may be, and understanding, is a bug a bug? Is this a serious bug or is this a meaningless one? What does this number of bugs, ultimately mean for us? And I just also want to say that this presentation would not have been possible for me personally if it weren't for someone named Damian Sinadinos. Long ago, well, not that long ago, just that in-person conferences feel so long ago, I was at a conference where Damian gave a presentation called Words Matter, not Words Matter, but Word Smatter, S-M-A-T-T-E-R. You can find it on YouTube. I highly recommend watching it. I've watched it a dozen times. And he talks about the inarguable importance of semantics. If you don't understand what semantics, or if you don't know what semantics are, we've already discussed the importance of understanding what words mean, of making sure your audience understands what words mean. That's what semantics is. Semantics are really important. They are the study of meaning, reference, or truth. When is a time that you would not need an understanding of what words meant or what they were referring to or what their truth was? How did the phrase, let's not get bogged down in semantics, ever become even a thing? How irresponsible or even evil is that to encourage a conversation or someone's impression of you or your impression of someone else to carry on without understanding what a situation means, what words mean? Words or actions or bugs don't have to mean the same thing as they do to you as they do to someone else, but you have to know when that difference exists. And you as testers probably see this all the time when you discover a something that stands out to you as peculiar, and you think that it might be peculiar to somebody else. You're probably not the sole determiner of whether that thing is peculiar or whether it's a bug, whether it's meaningless or whether it's a showstopper. Those decisions are ideally made by groups of people from inside and outside your organization. I'm not a tester by trade, but I do have an example from my own life that I hope, again, that is relatable to you along the same lines of what Leandro was just talking about the number of bugs and whether a high number is important or valuable. My kids play a lot of video games. One of the things they love to do is to play a game and put it on either the easiest mode possible, or they love to play two players and just set the other controller down so that there's no one actually controlling the other opponent. And they'll be playing a sports game or a fighting game, and they'll just be slaying the opponent over and over and over. And they'll call me in to show me how high their score is, or they'll call me in to show that they're 500-0 in FIFA, or that they just beat someone in a baseball game 40-1 or something like that. And I go in all the time and complain about, why are you playing on this easy mode? And why aren't you playing harder? And why aren't you trying to get better? And why aren't you trying to do this? And they said, we're not trying to get better. We're just playing. We're trying to see how many home runs we can hit. We're trying to see how many red cards we can get. We're trying to see, they're acting like testers in some ways, trying to see if they can break the game by getting the entire team kicked off in a game of FIFA. They're trying to accomplish things that I wasn't trying to accomplish. You can see that as testers too. When people talk about the number of tests that they automated or the number of tests that they conducted, do you need more? Is that number good? Is that a high number? Is that a low number? Is it okay that it's a high or a low number? Can you get more? Should you get more? What will it cost? These are all discussions that need to be had, stories that need to be told around the importance of coming to a collective agreement of what those numbers represent and what value they give.
Now, let's get on to the interesting part, probably what you were coming here to learn and what all of the presentation has been interesting, but this is key where we will share some of the tips and recommendations finally.
We're going to show you how to improve and create some awesome, engaging QA stories.
Now, the first recommendation for telling awesome stories is to define. First, very first step, you need to define what are you trying to communicate? What is the message? You need to make sure that you are clear, exactly as crystal clear on what are you trying to communicate? What is you're trying to transmit? Is it a QA impact that you are trying to shout out without sounding like Chicken Little? Is it a bug that you found that you just need awareness, or you need to communicate the impact that that bug is probably going to create? Or you just need the defect that that bug raises to be fixed? Or it's just a concern that you have around that. You need to make sure that what you're trying to communicate with your story. You need to keep it narrow, punctual, and when you have a big story or with different things, not try to send everything at once. Defining very well what is the point of your story and what are you going to surround it. I like it a lot in the example that they gave with the Deadpool movie. where they were telling this is a love story. It talks about love, someone wanting to get together again with his loved one, where you might think, hey, it's an action movie. And they even made a clip, a trailer, which totally looked like a love story. But if you see it, if you see the writing, what is the reason that conveys all that action, all those gunshots, experiments in the laboratory, becoming mutant, all that, you will be able to tell that it's all propelled by love. That's the main reason of the first Deadpool movie. The other one was family. In a weird way, it was family. John Wick is about the love for puppies, and you should respect other people's puppies. So it's very important that you are very, very clear about what you're trying to say in your story, and to not to try to say too many things through your story, because it can become confusing. There are too many characters at the same time. You can end up being like, whoa, what just happened? We don't want that. We want our audience to be totally crystal clear about what you're trying to tell them.
Yeah, and one of the areas that you can make some of those inferences and where you can decide how to tell this story, how to share this news, how this finding with others, is around where you found the bug, where the bug exists within your software, but also even what time of year you found the bug. There's a great example online from a story by Bob Galen. Those who've attended TechWell Agile DevOps conferences in the past probably know Bob. He's spoken at these shows a million times, and he is an incredible storyteller. He's a true TechWell star. I would highly recommend attending his sessions when you have the chance. And he's got a great example of someone who finds a severity 1 bug. And you might think initially like, wow, severity 1, I don't even have to tell an important story around that one. That's super important. And it's like, but you still do. You still have to think about who it is you're going to report that bug to. Why are you reporting it? What are you hoping comes? Well, I mean, you're probably hoping it gets resolved because it's a severity 1 bug. But what would be some other details you might be able to determine or uncover that would help cause others to spring into action? It might just need a business case, which is pretty easy to spin up. I think you can really do that once you know the types of business your management is concerned with, or where your users and customers' business is concerned with. And in this example that Bob gives, he talks about identifying that this example is a software bug that occurs in a piece of accounting software, and it's a severity 1. It's like, great. But then he also reveals that it was found in Q4 of the year, almost the very end of the year. And he explains, which we'll kind of go into a little bit more in a minute, why it was very important that it was found in Q4, and that gave this tester something to really connect this story to be able to tell it to someone far outside of the testing or the development team to make it really relatable to them about the importance of this finding.
And another element that you need to be very, very aware when you are thinking on what story are gonna be told is your audience. Who are you gonna be telling it to? Because as I mentioned earlier, your audience may have different interests. Some of them might be wanting to see a movie about romance, or some others might be looking for an short action movie, or some others might want a 4-hour epic adventure. So it depends a lot. And you need to take into account what do they do, who they are they because they are all different people, not only because of these gender boxes, role boxes, place in the organization. Even personally, they can have different interests. But in general, in your organization, it will be defined as an example. The CEO might be worried or concerned or interested around the project competition. Why is it QA holding it? Or your CFO might be most interested on the cost of the defects, the cost of not going to production on the date agreed. All of these impacts might be greater importance to the CFO. The developers might be interested on finishing the code, that it worked well and that they can go home, or that they don't have to work too much and drink too much caffeine to fix the defects that were found by QA. And at the same time, QA could be very most interested on just having a polished solution, something that works in the best possible way for the user to use. The user, and that's another role that might be just like, hey, I want to use something that doesn't suck, that is good, that is easy, that flows, that has no defects. So they are always going to be a source of different relevancy. provided that you know them very well. Some others you might have to box them to predict who are them, what might they be interested in, or what do they do, how do they interact with your software. Some of them might be the very end users, they might have different interests, or you may have mixed roles where your CFO is going to be at the same time the end user. Well, you have a double situation, a double combo, where you can tell them differently. As I said in the movies, it could be a kid that just wants to see sparkles and something pretty. It can be someone looking for a romantic movie, or someone looking for an action film full of explosions and blood and people dying quickly. Like in the romantic or drama movie, might be just a single person dying slowly. So it depends on who are you telling the story to. Will define important things. What it will define, amigo Noel?
Yeah, it's the now how are you going to go out and tell your story? You've identified your audience. Leandro just talked about knowing your user. You know your users, you know the importance of this bug, you know your audience you're going to tell it to, you know the impact it was going to have. And the importance, again, of Bob's example of when this accounting bug was found in Q4. As Leandro just mentioned, the CFO, it turned out that this piece of software was used by a CFO. CFOs in Q4 of the year are likely wrapping up all of their end of year calculations, all of their important accounting that goes into that period of the year, and that a severity 1 bug found in Q4 by your user, maybe not found by you, but found by your user or experienced by your user as they're trying to accomplish a very important task, especially when your user might be as high up as the CFO, that's an important bug. And in Bob's example, he talks about the tester being able to tell this story to the VP of sales. How many times have you, as a tester, taken your findings to the VP of sales? I'm not saying you should have done that already. I'm just saying, have you ever even thought about the opportunity? I haven't spoken to the VP of sales personally. I've given presentations where that person has been in the room along with some other people. But this whole presentation, as Leandro and I have put this together, have made me think I have so many stories that I love telling that I often just tell to those in my team, other marketers, other communicators, other PR folks, because it's relatable. It's easy. I already know it's easy. I already know it's relatable. I already know how to tell it. I've told those stories 1,000 times in the rooms. Everyone's going to understand. But getting out and telling your story to a different crowd of people can really help you get better and better at storytelling and connecting with other groups and showing the importance of your work, especially when, to be honest, marketing folks, PR folks, testers, communications professionals, they're not so different, and that we are fairly far removed from sales sometimes, or are far removed from the work of a CFO, that kind of level. So to get in there and say, I've got important stories to tell. This relates to what you are challenged with. This relates to what you're trying to accomplish. Look at this work that I or my team did. You can model your story in some very repeatable, proven ways to connect with people, no matter how far outside of your team or your organization or just the industry as a whole are. It doesn't really matter. You can do all of these things of knowing your users, knowing your audience, knowing what they're challenged by, knowing what sorts of things interest them and which do not, to really have a lot of success, to tell a great story to increasingly more and more diverse groups, which is a huge asset for you, your team, your organization, and anything else you want to benefit from. Storytelling is important. It's not, I won't say it's hard, it just requires some work, but the benefits are tremendous.
To close up with their recommendations, and very meta to close up, is the last recommendation. You need to close your story in general with an epic ending, something that is incredible, awesome, that generates a big impression in your audience.
Doing so will make sure your audience does not forget your story.
Exactly, just like in this presentation, we are now getting close to the ending, and we're going to do an epic close, an epic ending to this story that we have been telling you.
This was Communicating with QA. We hope you enjoyed it. Noel out.
And as well, Leandro out.
Now to finish for real, I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you so much for being here, for taking a chance on a story that maybe it did not sound like one you expected to find in the agenda, or maybe even knowing what you were going to get out of it. I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope you have questions. I hope you ask them during the Q&A, or you can also ask them to either one of us. We'll share our contact info again. I think it's going to be on the screen here shortly. But thank you so much for sitting through this, and we hope you got a lot out of it.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for enduring our silliness. And I want to thank again to TechWell for this Star East event, for inviting us, allowing us to speak. It has been a pleasure. It's always a blast. And again, everyone, thank you very much for enduring this presentation.
It's time for QA. And there is our contact info there again on Twitter. You can reach either one of us there. Would love to have you reach out, share some feedback, ask some questions, talk about some points that were confusing. Not every question has to be a validation of your amazing story. Sometimes it may be a question about why did you include this part? Why didn't you include that part? I love being challenged because what it does is helps me make sure to tell a better story next time.
And as Noel very well says, before that, just in case you don't have the chance to ask your question right now, here are our contact information, just in case you want to reach out to us to ask more questions, give comments, any congratulations, hopefully, after this. On my end, you can look for me on most of the social networks as Señor Performo or at SRPERF, as you can see on the screen. And
reach out to me at Noel Wurst.
All right. Now, thank you everyone again, and it's time for a good old Q&A. Thank you, everybody.